I'd like to welcome everyone. My name is Grayley McWaters. I'm representing the ISPI Chapter Bay Boise State Chapter of ISPI. And welcome to our monthly webinar. Today's session is entitled Write a Stronger Survey Instrument Using Evidence-Based Practices. How to write a stronger survey instrument using evidence-based practices. We have three presenters with us today: Yonnie Chyung, Ieva Swanson, and Jennifer Shamsy. I'd like to take just a minute to introduce our presenters and then hand it over to them. And at this time, I'd like to introduce Yonnie Chyung. Yonnie is a professor of the Department of Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning in the College of Engineering at Boise State. She teaches graduate courses on program evaluation and quantitative research, and runs a workplace-oriented research central lab, or WORC Work Lab for short. You may hear that term throughout the presentation, where teams of practitioners and researchers conduct research on various topics in the HPI context. A series of articles on evidence-based survey design written by her work teams is scheduled to be published in the Performance Improvement Journal. Ieva Swanson is currently an instructional designer for Scottrade in St. Louis, Missouri. Since 2007, her professional and volunteer experience has included multimedia course design and development, instruction, facilitation, and learning management administration. She volunteers as a technology chair for the ISPI Bay Area Boise State Chapter, and she has earned her Master of Science degree in Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning from Boise State in 2016, and she currently participates in Professor Chyung's work lab. Jennifer Shamsy is a commercial airline pilot and adjunct online instructor. She graduated in spring 2017 with a Master of Science degree in Organizational Performance and Workplace Learning and a Workplace Instructional Design Graduate Certificate from Boise State. Since graduation, Jennifer has participated in Professor Chyung's work lab, and most notably, she has contributed to Professor Chyung's research in the area of evidence-based survey design, and more specifically in the use of negatively worded items in surveys. So, without further ado, I would like to hand it over to the three ladies to present to you Writing a Stronger Survey Instrument. Thank you.
Thank you, Grayley. All right, let's get started. So, hello, this is Yonnie Chyung, and welcome to the webinar. As Grayley mentioned, I teach at Boise State University, and I run a research lab. So, you will hear what we have been doing in our research teams, and we will be publishing 3 articles, and 1 this fall, and 2 this coming spring. And 2 other presenters today, Ieva Swanson and Jennifer Shamsy, are from my research teams. And so today's presentation is based on the first 2 articles that we wrote. But we won't be able to talk about everything that we wrote in the articles. So we will post the references of the articles at the end of our presentation in case you want to have a copy of articles when they come out. All right? So let's get started. When you design a survey, you can develop a structured or unstructured survey questionnaire, right? In structured surveys, you use closed-ended questions, whereas in unstructured surveys, you use open-ended questions. And our presentation today is about how to design structured survey instruments. And each closed-ended question contains either a question or statement and a response scale such as the Likert scale. So here's an example of a closed-ended question. You have a statement that says, in my organization, people are rewarded for learning. And you have a 5-point scale. Or you can have a 4-point scale too, without a midpoint, neutral. Here, let me stop and ask you something, and I want you to write down your answer in the chat box if you want. The question is, between a 5-point scale, Likert scale, and a 4-point Likert scale, which one do you usually use? You may use both types of scale depending on the situation, but do you have a preference? So please go ahead and write down either 5-point or 4-point, just to share your preference with us. There's no right or wrong answer here, just a preference. By the way, the Likert scale was developed by an American psychologist, Francis Likert, in the 1930s. I don't know if you knew, but it was originally a 5-point scale: strongly approve, approve, undecided, disapprove, and strongly disapprove. But as you know, these days, some people use a 5-point scale, and some people use 4-point scale. All right, so we see some answers here, and some people say 5-point, and some people say 4, a little bit more 5-point than 4-point. All right. So, like I said, there's no right or wrong answer here, and we'll talk about pros and cons of both types of scale today. So, you have your own preference as to whether you use a 5-point scale or 4-point scale, and you probably have some good ideas about what is a good and strong survey design and what is not. Today we'll be talking about some of the things that we found in the literature that will help you write an even stronger survey instrument. So in our presentation, we'll focus on 2 topics here. So first one is whether to include or exclude a midpoint in the Likert scale. This is basically about whether to use an odd number scale, like a 5-point scale or 7-point scale, or even number scale, like a 4-point scale or a 6-point scale. And this is also related to the issue of whether to treat the Likert scale as an ordinal scale or an interval scale, and why it matters to you. The second question or topic is about whether to use only positively worded survey items or use both positively and negatively worded items. And we'll talk about what you can do to avoid situations where you can get some incorrect, invalid data because your survey design. That would be bad, wouldn't it? So what we are hoping today is during or at the end of the presentation, we hope that you'll feel like, I haven't thought about that before, but I guess I'll start paying attention to that. Or you might say, I always wonder about that, and now I know why and how. So that's our goal. So now I will hand this to Ieva, and she'll talk about the first topic, the use of midpoint in the Likert scale. Ieva?
Oh, thank you, Yonnie. As Yonnie said, the Likert scale was originally developed as a 5-point scale with a midpoint in it, neutral or neither agree nor disagree. Adding a midpoint allows respondents to express their true, neutral, or indifferent opinion. In this sense, they're not forced to agree or disagree. But we've also seen or used a Likert scale without a midpoint, and in this case, the 4-point scale without a midpoint does force respondents to either agree or disagree. So here's something to think about for a moment. When you use a 5-point Likert scale with a midpoint, do you, personally, consistently use the midpoint to express your neutral opinion? Because interestingly enough, research has shown that some survey respondents use the midpoint as a dumping ground for answers that don't really fit the response scale well. We'd like to share a few research studies that dig into the question of what a midpoint means to survey respondents. Kulev and Stokowski's 2009 study tested survey item statements that deliberately weren't a good match for a typical 5-point Likert scale. Approximately 1/3 of the statements in their 100-item assessments were demonstrably unclear, intrusive, or requiring self-awareness. The researchers then asked students to respond to these statements using two different response scales. In version 1, respondents used a typical 5-point Likert scale. I don't think you'll be surprised to learn the result here. The respondents heavily used the midpoint for the unclear and intrusive survey statements. In version 2, respondents were forced to select an answer from one of 4 descriptors. It depends, uncertain, average, or not applicable. These responses were more appropriate for the unclear and intrusive statements. The majority of students in the study were tested on both response versions. When the researchers correlated the descriptor responses from version 2 to the middle point from version 1, would you like to guess which one of the descriptors was most commonly associated with the midpoint? Go ahead. You can write in chat one of the 4 options you think the researchers might have found. I know it's a little bit awkward to guess when you don't actually know what the statement words that they were responding to, so I'm not going to keep you in suspense much longer. I see there's a lot of folks guessing uncertain, some guessing it depends. If you guessed it depends, that's what they found in their research. This is interesting because this response suggests that perhaps there were some factors that were unnamed in the survey statements that could swing the response in either direction. The students might also have felt ambivalent about the topic, or maybe they wanted to provide a socially acceptable answer instead of being uncomfortably frank about an intrusive topic. Knowing that the meaning of the midpoint could be problematic, Nadler, Western, and Voiles chose to eliminate the midpoint to see what would happen. These researchers developed a political opinion survey. They offered a typical 5-point Likert scale. That was their version 1. They also offered a 4-point Likert scale that eliminated the midpoint in a second version. And in version 3, they added a no opinion option to their 4-point Likert response scale. One of the notable results they found was that when they used version 3, a lot of survey respondents chose the no opinion option. The no opinion option is not part of the Likert scale. So when you're doing analysis, you exclude the no opinion data from the response scale. Consequently, the researchers had a dramatic reduction in the sample size for version 3, which you can see as the orange bar on the far right, meaning the sample for how they analyzed their response scale data. The large number of no opinion responses seems to imply that some of the respondents who completed version 1 and version 2 chose an option that does not accurately reflect their thoughts. Additionally, no matter which version the students took, the researchers provided an example of a 5-point Likert scale and directly asked respondents how they interpreted the midpoint. The students were given a free response format to write in whatever they wished. I used a word cloud to proportionately diagram a condensed version of the students' responses. As you can see, the researchers' open-ended data show that the students interpreted the midpoint in several ways. Because they were doing a political opinion survey, perhaps it isn't surprising that the #1 interpretation of the midpoint was no opinion. That was 15% of the respondents. Perhaps an unnamed factor was at work in some of the statements, so that it would be accurate to say that you both agree and disagree. 10% of the respondents said this. Furthermore, the midpoint sometimes literally indicates a neutral attitude towards the topic, about 10% of the time in this case. The topic doesn't apply, 3%, or inspire any attitude at all. Don't care got a whopping 14%. Now, if you happen to like your data presented in a clean, linear fashion, here's the same data again as a bar graph, just so you can see how those responses are relative to each other for that particular survey. In the third study I'd like to share today, Dutch researchers surveyed young people in 1991 and followed up with the same population 3 years later in 1994. Once again, the survey that they did was attempting to capture political opinions, which are not always best aligned with a traditional Likert scale. In this study, instead of eliminating the midpoint, the researchers combined a traditional 5-point Likert scale with an additional don't know option. The youngest adolescents in the 1991 survey often used don't know responses or just returned non-responses, resulting in missing data. The researchers took this outcome as a reflection of lack of political knowledge given the respondents' young ages. By the time they were surveyed again in 1994, the number of don't know responses and non-responses had decreased, but midpoint responses had increased. The increased responses led the researchers to wonder about the desire for respondents to give more substantive answers, demonstrating either that they truly held a neutral opinion or they hadn't formed an opinion yet, even though they possessed some political knowledge. The researchers recommended retaining the midpoint to capture neutral opinions and to continue to add don't know options to help separate this different but legitimate response from the midpoint. So where did the considerations raised by research leave us? First of all, you can include or exclude a midpoint. Neither one is more correct than the other. The research we presented today showed some problems associated with a midpoint. However, there are cases when you need to use a midpoint to obtain interval data, which I'll explain in a minute. What we learned from research is that if we omit a midpoint or don't, it's still good to add other options such as it depends, no opinion, don't know, or maybe not applicable to a Likert agree-disagree scale. These options help you obtain more accurate data because without them, some respondents may use the midpoint as a dumping ground. We recommend being selective about additional options and observing reasonable limits on how many you add. For example, the Dutch research team wondered if young respondents didn't want to click on the don't know option because they did know something about the political situation but might not yet have formed an opinion. On future political opinion surveys, they might reasonably capture neutral opinions with a midpoint on their response scale, and then add both no opinion and don't know options to cover these possibilities. Nadler et al. Offered an even longer list of alternative interpretations, which could be a better match for some survey statements. As a designer, you can examine the social context and the survey statements for clues to help you know which options to add, if any. I promised I wouldn't just address the respondent point of view, but also the data collection side of response scales. We'll talk about data collection and analysis in this section. Earlier, I briefly explained that you may have a situation where you need to include a midpoint in the Likert scale in order to obtain interval data. To introduce the ideas of interval and ordinal data, let's do an experiment together. I'll show you 3 different figures. In each figure, 2 of the 5 anchors of the Likert scale will be in different positions. As I show all 3 figures, think about which one most accurately represents the relative meanings of strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, and strongly agree. So here's figure A, where any 2 consecutive anchors have an equal distance between them. We're illustrating these equal distances with numbers, as on a number line. Think about the label meanings. Is the meaning of strongly disagree as far from disagree as the meaning of disagree is from neutral? Now I'll go on to figure B, and the positions will move. Here's figure B, where strongly disagree and disagree are close together, and agree and strongly agree are close together. So again, think about the meanings here of these anchor labels. Are they positioned accurately with respect to each other? Lastly, here's figure C, where disagree and agree are close to neutral. Now that you've had a chance to sort of think about this a bit, I'm going to run through the 3 figures again. This time, I'm going to ask you to use chat and post the letter of the figure you think most accurately describes the relationships between the meanings of the labels. For example, if you choose figure C here, you'd be saying that in your opinion, the meaning of disagree is closer to neutral than to strongly agree. Okay, so let's go. Here's figure A once again, and here's figure B, and lastly figure C. All right, what am I seeing? I see a lot of people looking at A, some B's, some C's. Yeah, all over the place. What we've been exploring in this experiment is whether the traditional Likert scale is an interval or an ordinal scale. There's an ongoing debate about this distinction. Those of you who preferred figure A were treating the labels on a traditional Likert scale as an interval scale. In order for the Likert scale to be an interval scale, survey respondents must perceive that the meaning between any 2 consecutive anchor labels is the same distance or interval from each other. A thermometer is an example of an instrument that measures on an interval scale. Each degree marking measures an equal change in temperature. If you thought a traditional Likert scale was probably not capturing data in equal intervals on a survey, it might nevertheless be capturing relative order. This is true of a 4-point scale. Once you remove the midpoint, the scale no longer measures in intervals. Ordinal scales are less precise, such as this example of measuring water with a bucket. Being less precise does not make those types of scales a bad choice, however. With an ordinal scale, you can tell if you have a little water or a lot, and for some purposes, like washing your car, that's good enough. Worcester and Burns conducted a study similar to our experiment just now. They provided nearly 2,000 adults with a few typical Likert scale anchor labels, such as agree. Then they added various modifiers, such as tends to agree and slightly agree. They provided a line and asked respondents to visualize where they thought these anchor labels belonged. Respondents marked on the line where they thought the modified anchor labels fell, not just relative to each other, but relative to the center point and end points. What they got was something like this. We added numbers to the line to illustrate that by adding these modifiers, the traditional 5-point Likert scale gets closer to measuring equal intervals between response options. Relative to strongly agree and strongly disagree, the researchers found that slightly agree and slightly disagree are significantly closer to number 2 and number 4 on our little number line here than agree and disagree respectively. So when you add the word slightly in front of agree and disagree, you have a higher chance of measuring interval data in a 5-point Likert scale. In other words, a traditional Likert scale was ordinal and a bit like measuring water in a bucket. Worcester and Burns helped calibrate that scale, kind of like tuning a piano so that each key hits the appropriate note in the scale. A modified or calibrated traditional Likert scale can approach an interval scale. When you know you'll get a closer match to true interval distances, then you can assign numerical values to the data you collect and present meaningful average scores. Now, it isn't always practical to take the time to test and calibrate your response scale. An interval scale may not even be necessary to fulfill your purpose. Knowing that you have a lot of water is enough information to go ahead and wash the car, remember. So recognizing ordinal categories for what they are helps researchers present their data more meaningfully. Look at the 5-point ordinal scale here on the screen. It measures frequency using rarely, sometimes, often, and always. I skipped over never. Sorry about that. It would not make much sense to assign numerical values like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 to the 5 levels of frequency and calculate an average score. A percentage of respondents selecting each category should convey a clear picture, though. For instance, we could say 35% of respondents selected often, but only 20% selected always. Earlier, I presented some recommendations to offer one or more options in addition to a Likert response scale. If the response scale might not be a perfect fit for the statements that you've written. The survey item statement, "The program provides information useful to me," was used in a real-world survey by one of Yonnie's student teams. The team customized their scale and collected 2 I don't know responses from their additional options. If the team hadn't offered the 2 additional options next to the Likert scale, their 2 respondents might have chosen a midpoint, which would have resulted in invalid data, or those 2 respondents might have skipped the question altogether. In order for the team to present this data, they averaged the interval scale values separately, leaving the don't know responses out of their calculation. Then they presented the don't know responses as a percentage of the total responses. So in trying to answer our question, is the Likert scale an interval or ordinal scale, we pretty much wound up in the same place we did with what does the midpoint mean? It depends. Using a Likert scale with a midpoint does not in itself guarantee that data will be measured on an interval scale. If you'd like to analyze and present data using Likert-type scales, consider adding a modifying adverb to agree and disagree. For example, slightly agree and slightly disagree to make your scale closer to an interval scale. Assign numerical values to anchors and calculate an average score, or report as a percentage of responses if you doubt the interval nature of your scale. By eliminating the midpoint, the 4-point Likert scale becomes an ordinal scale. When using an ordinal scale, add additional options such as don't know in order to reduce non-response rates, and consider reporting a percentage of responses instead of calculating an average score. Thanks for listening. Here's Jennifer, who will explain how you can strengthen your surveys further.
Hey, Ivy. Thank you so much, Ieva. I think you've done a really great job of reminding us of the importance of response scales. But that's really only half of the story here. Structured survey items don't just include a response scale. They also include a statement, which is a very important part of it. And so our second topic is going to be about how to design the survey statement itself, and then more specifically, if we should be using positively or negatively worded statements. So when you're sitting down to craft your survey, at first thought, using positively worded statements or even a mix of positively or negatively might not be that big of a deal. But in our research, we actually found that it can be a very big deal when talking about the accuracy of your survey instrument. So let's delve into the importance of statement wording. Again, even before you sit down and actually start writing out statements, there's a bit of work to be done. You need to have a clear understanding of the concept or the construct that you want to measure. And this is especially true with abstract concepts. Abstract concepts usually include multiple characteristics, and so you're usually going to have to use multiple items to measure those. So what's a good rule of thumb? How many items should you be using for an abstract concept? Well, typically a recommendation or a good rule of thumb is that you use 4 or more survey items for each concept that you're trying to measure. So now that we know how many items we're going to need to measure, let's take a look at an example. I took a 55-item survey questionnaire that's available on the internet, and it measures if your organization is a learning organization. And this is an example of a structured survey. So with number 1, we have the statement, which is people help each other learn. And then we have the response scale that Ieva talked about quite a bit. We have almost never anchor on the left, and then another 6 points, and then almost always on the right. So that's the 2 different parts of your structured survey item. In this particular questionnaire, all of the items were positively stated. But again, that idea might kind of creep into your head. Should I be using all positively worded statements, or might there be a reason why negatively worded statements would be important? Maybe like when you're measuring barriers to becoming a learning organization. So in the second question here, we have people can get money and other resources to support their learning. That's a positively worded statement. But would it be better to maybe reword it like there is not enough money and resources to support employees' learning activities? Which is going to be better? So let's talk about that a little bit. But before we actually talk about it, I want to get an idea of what your experiences have been. So in your last survey that you took part of or that you even created, did you use just positively worded statements, or did you actually use a mix of positively and negatively worded statements? And so in the chat box, if you would just say positive only or plus or a mix, kind of give us an idea of some of your experiences. Looks like a good kind of even balance. A lot of positives there, but a mix too. All right, sounds like everybody has some experience with actually using the different types in your surveys. So let's talk about some of the pros and cons of using positively or negatively or a mix of the 2 in your surveys. There's a lot of reasons why a respondent responds to a survey item the way that they do. And probably most of us can relate to a lot of this. Some just want to please the researcher, while others want to get to the end as quickly as they humanly can to the end of that survey. And so they'll just kind of agree or disagree with statements, but it doesn't really reflect what they think. And in fact, in the research, we found that respondents actually have a tendency to agree more than they disagree, which is termed acquiescence, response set bias, or yay-saying bias. And so in order to guard against this bias, we go back to our friend Likert. And he suggested that you actually mix items, the negative and the positively worded items, almost an even balance, a 50-50 mix, to guard against this response set bias. And this does a couple of different things. It was thought that mixing these 2 types of statements in a survey would better keep the attention of your respondent, and then it would also better help identify which statements might be suffering from this response set bias. So in doing this, survey designers could actually increase the accuracy of their data, or so they thought. But when you do create, or when you solve one problem, you usually end up creating another. And so that's what we might have in this particular situation. So let's turn to Keller's ARCS model, which you may or may not be familiar with. It's a framework to measure a learner's motivation. And so those are based on 4 concepts or constructs: attention, relevance, confidence, and satisfaction. And so we're going to look and see if when solving this response set bias problem, you actually end up creating this other problem that we just mentioned or alluded to, that there might be a threat to validity and reliability in your survey instrument. So let's plug some examples into Keller's ARCS model. First, we have the attention construct. And in blue, we have our positively worded statement: the role play was interesting to me. Then we also have a negatively worded statement: the video presentation was distracting. Now you can make your negatively worded statements a couple of different ways. You can word them different ways. One common way is to add the word not, so the video presentation was not distracting. That can create a negated form. Then you can also use what we have here, which is the use of a polar opposite word, which is a word that means opposite. And so in this case we have distracting. Either way, regardless of which way that you do your statement or you make it negatively worded, it can increase the respondent's ability to process, takes a little additional cognitive resources, and it also might be a little bit more difficult for them to process that and really get to the meaning of what's being stated or asked. Let's take a couple more examples. We have relevance. Again, your positively worded statement in blue. The examples were relevant to my job. And then we have the polar opposite, or the negatively worded statement. The examples were unimportant for my job. Now, kind of going back to this polar opposite issue. The positive statement is pretty easy to understand. Respondents can usually fairly quickly ascertain if they agree or disagree with that statement. Now, when you start making negatively worded with the word not, or especially when you use that polar opposite word, now you're starting to increase the cognitive resources that they need. It might be a little bit more confusing, a little bit more tiring to them. And more importantly, you get to this situation where you're really trying to determine exactly what you're measuring. So in this case, relevant and unimportant, are these really the same thing? Even though unimportant is an antonym for relevant, it doesn't necessarily measure the same construct. It doesn't really necessarily mean the direct opposite. So that's one thing that you have to be keeping in mind when you word your statements in a negative format, is you have to be aware that you might be actually changing the nature of what you're measuring and unnecessarily changing the cognitive resources that you're asking your respondent to use to process, and all of this can affect the accuracy of your data. So a couple more examples that might help better illustrate this. The first row, we have our positively worded statement. The objectives were clear. Pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to process, and decide whether you agree or disagree. Then we go down to our second row. The objectives were not clear. Now this is our negatively worded statement, and now we've added in that not to make that statement negative. Takes a few more minutes for the respondent to maybe figure out if they agree or disagree. Might be a little bit more cognitively taxing. Now we come down to our third row with our direct negative. The objectives were unclear. We've used unclear, which is a polar opposite, and now we get back into that problem where are we really measuring what we think we are? Are we really changing the meaning? And it also takes, again, a little bit more resources for them to process that information. At that point, they might start to have some attention issues. They might start to become frustrated, confused, a little tired. At this point, when you're using these kind of statements, your survey might start to lose a little accuracy. And then finally, we have the negated negative, or better known as the double negative, and that's the objectives were not unclear. Now we've added in a couple of different elements. We have the polar opposite, we have not. This is where things get very difficult for the respondent. They're having to use a lot of cognitive resources to process. It may be difficult for them to figure out what's being asked. They get confused, fatigued. And almost all of the research that we found on this topic, there really was very little, if any, cases where you should be using the double negative in your survey. It just creates too many issues and really challenges the accuracy of your survey. So let's take some specific research that we came about in this endeavor that we took to better understand positively and negatively worded statements. We looked at one study by Jill Johnson, Dennis Bristow, and Kenneth Schneider in 2004. And I think the data that you'll find from this research study really helps to support that hypothesis that adding negatively worded statements can cause some problems in your instrument validity and reliability. And so Johnson, Bristow, and Schneider, they surveyed 253 undergraduate students at a large Midwestern university in the U.S. that were enrolled in business or business-related courses. And they used the Fashion Consciousness Scale, which measures a single construct or a single factor, and it includes 7 positively worded items. They took this survey and they modified it a little bit, and they started to add in some negatively worded items, like those that we just talked about. And so here's the results. When you're looking at the columns, the second column shows when all of the survey items were positively worded. Then the column in the middle there, we have almost an even balance. We had 2 positively worded items and then 2 negatively worded items. And then the far right column, we have 2 positively worded and then 2 of those double negatively worded statements in the survey. Now the first row that's highlighted in gray that we'll talk about in just a minute is our factor loadings, or it's a measurement of validity. And just when you're looking at these results, higher is better. So anything over 0.70 is considered to be acceptable, and it would show increased validity or reliability. And so when we're looking at factor loadings, we're looking at a measurement of validity. And so the researchers found that as they started to move left to right, or as they started to add in those negatively worded statements, you'll see that the validity started to decrease, and especially when you add in those double negative word statements. So this means that the accuracy of that survey started to decrease, and you started to measure things other than the desired construct, which certainly doesn't help give us the valuable data that we need or that we want. And again, when you add in those double negative statements, that becomes a real problem. Okay, so the second row is Cronbach's alpha, and that's just a measurement of the reliability of the survey instrument. Again, as we move left to right, we see those numbers start to decrease. And so as you add in those negatively worded items, the instrument starts to become more unreliable. The respondents are starting to make less and less reliable responses. And so again, that's going to challenge the accuracy of your survey instrument. We especially see that with the double negative statements, where very, very low reliability. And so again, these results in total kind of tell us 2 different things, or 2 important things in the context of our discussion today. It reminds us, number one, that double negative statements aren't good, and they really do impact our surveys on terms of validity and reliability. So it's most likely best not to use those unless there's really a compelling reason why. And then secondly, it kind of challenges Likert's advice about mixing positively and negatively worded items. So let's look at some other studies that we reviewed. In all of those studies, we really found that mixing positively and negatively worded statements comes at the high cost of reduced validity and reliability, just like we saw in that Johnson, Bristow, and Schneider study. And what we also found from our literature review, and we kind of came to the understanding, was that it's really our general recommendation that it's better not to mix the different types of statements. However, if we only use positively worded statements, we're back to that original problem again. Our respondent's going to start to fall back into that yay-saying bias, that response set bias. Now, regardless of whether you use a mix or positively or negatively worded statements, no survey instrument is going to be perfect. So instead, what we want to do as survey designers is to find a way to get the attention of our respondents and to keep that attention and try to get the most valuable and accurate data that we want and that we need for our research issue. And so what can we do? Here's a couple of recommendations that we found in our research. The first is that, again, it's better if you don't mix positively and negatively worded statements. but there are some times where you just can't get around that. So what's the best way to approach it? And so one study showed that if you group positively worded statements and negatively worded statements in different sections of your survey and you provide clear directions, this will draw the attention of the respondent and forewarn them about the different nature of these two types of statements. And the cue then reminds them that they're going to need to process these statements a little bit differently, and hopefully it will minimize the response set bias. So here's an example of that. You'll see that all of the positively worded statements are grouped together at the top. I feel very active, I think I can do a lot in a day, etc., and they have clear directions. And then the negatively worded items are grouped together. I feel tired easily, I dread having to do things, and those also are accompanied with very clear directions. Another recommendation is in the area of wording. And so again, sometimes you have to mix, so what's the best way to word your negatively worded statement? So going back to the ARCS model, I grabbed one of the examples, and so we have, I am confident in using the new skills. That's the positively worded statement. Now if we keep pretty much the bones of that statement and we add in that word not in the middle column, now we have the negated positive form. Your negatively worded statement is I am not confident in using the new skills. Causes your respondents to have to exert a little bit more cognitive resources to process. It might take them a couple more minutes to determine if they agree or disagree, but all in all they should be able to pretty much be able to navigate those waters and respond appropriately. However, when we go to our direct negative format, which is on the right-hand side, that final column, I am apprehensive in using the new skills. Now we're using that polar opposite word. And just to recap, when you use polar opposite words, again, you might be measuring something else than what you desire. Is confident and apprehensive really the same thing? And so you run into some issues there with accuracy of your survey instrument. And actually, in several studies, we did found that researchers seemed to prefer, based on evidence, using the negated positive or that not format. It's easier to understand that respondents might get a little tired, they might have to use some additional cognitive resources, but ultimately they can get to a point where they can process it and respond appropriately, as opposed to measuring something totally different than what you would have desired. So it's less risky to use and to accept the limitations with the negated positive form. And the final recommendation is not so much a recommendation, it's more of a reminder. When you're using a mix of positively and negatively worded survey items and you want to combine the data from both, you need to use a reverse coding strategy. So in number one, we have, in my organization, people help each other. That's a positively worded statement. Let's say that your respondent strongly disagrees with that, so you would code it as 1. Now when you get to number 2, this is our negatively worded statement. In my organization, people are not given enough time for learning. When you're including the negatively worded statements in your overall survey data and you're combining it with the positive, you need to actually flip your response scale. So in this case, strongly disagree would be coded as 5. This is very important to make sure that your data is accurate when you're mixing the different types of statements. So in this particular topic area, we've covered a lot of ground pretty quickly. Just to summarize, negatively worded statements can be used to counteract that response set bias that I mentioned, that yay-saying bias. But respondents might have some difficulty in comprehending those negatively worded statements, and they can threaten validity and reliability. So based on evidence-based research, it's really suggested that it's best not to use a mix of positively and negatively worded statements. Or if you do use them, you should use them with caution. But in some cases, there's really just no way to get around it, and especially it might actually be appropriate to use negatively worded statements, such as if you're measuring depression or fatigue. And as we mentioned, no survey instrument is going to be perfect. And really, so stronger survey design should focus on a continuous improvement process, little baby steps, balancing act to use the appropriate design decisions to meet the needs of your particular situation. And if you are going to mix positively and negatively worded statements, we provided a couple of recommendations. Those include separating them into two groups, positive in one, negative in the other, forewarning the respondents about the presence of those negatively worded statements, and then also wording your statements using that negated positive form or using the not word as opposed to a polar opposite. And then finally, it's important to remember that reverse coding is needed if you are going to combine the data from both types of statements in your survey. So just to summarize our entire webinar, and then we're going to open it up to questions. Again, we have covered a lot of ground today, and there'll be a lot more detail in the information that we're going to provide after this webinar. There's a lot of research on which to draw when creating and developing your survey instrument, and we've really only scratched the surface, both in this webinar and even in the journal articles. But today we talked about evidence-based survey design in two major areas. We talked about the pros and cons of including a midpoint in the Likert scale and the value of using an I don't know, it depends, or a not applicable option. We also talked about the 5-point Likert scale and adding slightly in front of agree or disagree and how that helps you get interval data. And then finally, we talked about the pros and cons of positively and negatively worded statements and then providing some guidance on what you should do when you're using a mix of the two. And just one last note before we turn it over to questions. As part of the participation in this webinar, we'd like to extend a link for a handout. And the link's on the slide here, and then also Yonnie will be posting it in the chat window here in just a second. And that handout summarizes and expands on some of the information that we present today, and it includes the references of the research that we've cited in this webinar. I think, and also Ieva and Yonnie, I know, we all agree that this is going to be a valuable addition to your toolbox and really support you in making evidence-based design decisions and creating your next structured survey instrument. So at this time, I think we'd like to turn it over to any questions that you have. So feel free, please, to type in any questions that you have in the chat box. And if for some reason we don't answer your question fully, or you desire additional information, or you have additional questions later on, please feel free to email us. We'll have our email addresses up in just a moment. So what questions can we answer for you?
This is Yonnie, and Michelle posted a question, and she says, how do I know if the survey is measuring what I intended for it to measure? And is it simply based on the types of responses I receive? It's a really great question. There are lots of ways to do it, and I really cannot answer this question within 1 or 2 minutes. But basically, things that you can consider doing is a couple of validity testing. Face validity is the basic validity testing, which is basically you do some testing with a bunch of people and say, hey, what do you think about this wording? Is it clear to you? That is basically face validity. And then after that, you can also conduct what's called content validity, which is similar to bring this instrument to the expert and say, hey, what should I do? I designed this instrument based on, let's say, ARCS model, or based on some type of model out there or theory. And I did that, but do you think it is appropriate to include these statements, or what do you think? That's the expert-based validity testing. And then third type of validity is the construct validity. It is requiring statistical analysis, and that's very rigorous validity testing, and it takes about a couple of courses that you have to take to learn how to do that. SPSS that we're using in one of our courses, research courses, we don't cover that because it's a huge topic, but you can use SPSS to conduct a content validity testing for your instrument. So that's my short answer for that.
There's a new question from Michelle Robertson. To ensure I understand, it's okay to ask positive or negative but not both? Would you like to speak to that, Yonnie? Or Jennifer?
What is the question? Jennifer, maybe?
I think in our research, and I'm sure Yonnie's going to have some things to add here, we looked at, usually the combinations would be positively worded statements or a mix. I don't think we ran across too much research that actually used negatively worded statements only. I don't recall.
Yeah. Negative stated items are things that I saw was like a depression. I mean, the nature of the thing that you're measuring is negative anyway, because lots of things that depressed people are experiencing. So your survey items will be written in a negative way anyways. But other than that, the common recommendation is actually toward not using it unless you have to use it. Especially if you're worried about this validity issue. In my own research, I also found that when I mix positively and negatively stated items, the negative stated items become a separate construct, which I didn't intend to do. So I could see that very bad phenomenon that other research articles are talking about. So since then, I kind of keep in mind that, yeah, unless I really have to, I better not use it. That's my take on it, but it's up to other people. So it's good to expose yourself to the research articles and say what's out there and what kind of recommendation we get from research.
And I think to add on to your comments there, Michelle, is that this is not a one-factor issue. There's in all the research that we did, there were multiple factors that are involved with this, and so we're presenting somewhat of a simplistic view of that, and we couldn't present all of the factors. But I think the main thing that you worry about with a positively worded statement is that as you're going through the survey, the respondent is getting used to the statements, and oh, this one's just like the last one. They're hurrying through, and they're being what the research calls careless. And in one study, they showed that within 10 minutes, 12 minutes or so, respondents have kind of checked out of your survey. And so you want to make sure that each survey statement and then response scale, each survey item, is really kind of attacking what you want to measure and kind of get in and get out and try to avoid some of those opportunities where a respondent could become careless or not attentive, and that's what's really going to affect your accuracy.
Margaret asked a question. She says, I have also seen the Likert scale used with the endpoints being complete sentences. Any comments on that? I don't know if you are referring to a format that has only 2 ending points labeled and maybe 1 through 5 or 10 written. So full 10 sentences or phrases only on 2 endpoints, and then between them you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and have the respondents choose 1 out of those 5 points or 10 points. Yes, you can do that. It's similar to the regular Likert scale, and there is some researchers might use that with hopes that, okay, if I use this scale, then it's going to be close to an interval scale, when the Likert scale traditionally is viewed as an ordinal scale. But there's an argument about that. I mean, some people say, yeah, it is close to intervals, and so you can use the statistical analysis that require interval data. But some people say, hey, this is still not an interval data. It is ordinal data still. So it is also an ongoing debate. So it's up to the researchers how you want to use it, and then basically we have to be careful about how you use it, and then test it so that interval data will also normally distribute it. Then you're in a better shape. So 3 articles actually that we wrote will come out. 1 this fall, PI journal, and 2 this coming spring. So if you just watch whenever they put out their publications, then you may want to watch and see what's out there. So we are writing our email addresses, so feel free to contact us. If you can include all our email addresses, and then That will be helpful so we all know who is asking what questions and we can respond to your questions outside this webinar. So we are 1 minute to the time limit. So thank you everyone for coming to the webinar and attending this. And we are planning to, if you accept it, planning to present something similar to that at ISPI conference next spring. So we hope that we'll see some of you there too. So thank you, Ieva, Jennifer, great job.
Yes, thank you very much, everybody, for attending. Great questions.
Thank you so much for coming to the webinar, and please do ask us more questions if you have some. Feel free to email.